The day had begun like any other. A rustle of engines, the echo of vendors calling out, the screech of a child chasing after a worn-out kite. The neighborhood buzzed with the dull rhythm of daily life, where people lived side by side, yet rarely looked each other in the eye. It was one of those places where time seemed to stretch and fold into itself, and stories of pain were often buried beneath the surface of not my business. In the middle of this commotion, somewhere between the sound of honking rickshaws and clanking teacups, a scream pierced the air. It was faint at first, distant, high-pitched, fragile. It could have been mistaken for a child playing, a tantrum, or simply the squabble of siblings. But then it came again, louder, sharper, a scream that didn't carry anger but terror, a desperate cry for help that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the buildings. And yet no one stopped. An elderly shopkeeper glanced up for a moment but quickly turned his eyes back to counting coins. A group of teenagers walking past laughed nervously, their pace quickening as they avoided the alleyway where the sound had come from. A woman hanging laundry on the third-floor balcony paused briefly, muttered something under her breath, and shook her head before turning away. The scream came again. The people on the street heard it. There was no denying it. Some felt a twinge of discomfort, a flicker of guilt they'd never admit to, but they justified it instantly. It's not my place. Maybe it's just a family fight. Someone else will look into it. But no one did. Behind an old, rusted gate at the edge of the alley, hidden by a collapsing tin roof and the shadows of neglect, the sound was coming from a small house. More like a shell of one. Its paint peeled in chunks, windows covered with plastic sheets, and a heavy chain hung loosely over the main door. Inside, a young girl no older than 9 was crying out, her voice hoarse, her small fists banging against the wooden boards. She wasn't just calling for help. She was calling to be seen, to be saved, for someone to care. She had been locked in that house for hours, maybe days. Time had become a blur. Her voice cracked with each call, her throat burned, her small frame trembling from hunger and cold. Her clothes were torn, her body bore bruises, some fresh, some faded into painful memory. She had learned over time that screaming usually led to more pain. But today something in her snapped, or maybe it was hope. Maybe some small part of her still believed someone out there might listen. But the world outside had grown deaf. People had grown used to walking past suffering. They had learned to numb their hearts to the sight of pain. And over time, it became easier to look the other way. It wasn't cruelty. It was fear disguised as indifference, fear of getting involved, fear of blame, fear of consequence. The little girl screamed again. A stray dog barked in response from the far end of the alley, but that was all. The street remained alive with movement, yet empty in compassion. Not far from the alley, a father named Imran was walking home after a long shift at the textile factory. He looked exhausted, his shirt soaked in sweat, his hands stained from machinery oil. He wasn't thinking about much, just the ache in his back and the sound of his little boy's laughter waiting for him at home. As he turned onto the road leading to the main street, the scream reached him, faint, almost like a whisper wrapped in panic. He paused, tilted his head, heard it again. He looked around. No one else was reacting. For a moment, he thought he imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind, but then it came once more, and something in his chest clenched. It wasn't the volume of the scream that moved him. It was the pain inside it. It reminded him of something buried in his past, something he had spent years trying to forget. He stopped walking. People brushed past him. Some looked at him with irritation as he blocked the narrow walkway. But he didn't move. His feet, as if pulled by invisible strings, turned in the direction of the scream. He didn't know what he'd find. He didn't know who was inside that shadowy house, or why the sound called to him like it did. All he knew was that while others had chosen silence, his heart couldn't. Not today. Not when a child's voice was begging to be heard. And so, as the city kept moving, one man stepped into the alley, toward the scream everyone else had ignored. Not as a hero, not as a rescuer, just a father whose heart still knew how to feel. Imran moved slowly through the alley, each footstep hesitant but determined. The sound was clearer now, shaky gasps between choked-out cries. It wasn't just noise, it was the sound of a soul unraveling. The alley smelled of damp earth and old garbage, the walls narrowing the deeper he went, muffling the outside world behind him. There was something unsettling in the silence that surrounded the cry, like the air itself had given up on listening. He passed a stack of broken crates, an abandoned tricycle, and a wall smeared with fading graffiti. It was a path he'd never taken before, though he had walked this neighborhood 100 times. Funny, he thought, how suffering could be so close to us, and we still remain blind to it. The closer he got to the sound, the more a memory from years ago began to stir inside him, something he hadn't thought about in a long time. He had once been a boy just like her, curled up under a staircase, wishing someone would open a door and ask if he was okay. That door never opened. His cries were drowned in silence. Maybe that's why this scream didn't feel like a stranger's. It felt like his own, echoing back through time. Imran stopped in front of a crumbling structure on the left side of the alley. Its front yard was overgrown with weeds, and rust dripped from the gate like blood from an old wound. The sound was coming from there. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed the gate. It gave a loud creak, as if protesting its first movement in years. He stepped through, his boots crunching over broken glass and dry leaves. There were no lights. The house sat in shadow, except for a faint glimmer of daylight slipping through a cracked window pane. The scream came again, closer now, but this time it ended in a dry, empty cough. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was exhaustion. He stood at the front door. It looked bolted shut, but the chain hanging across it was not locked, only looped. Imran looked over his shoulder. No one was watching. No one was following. The street had already forgotten him. He reached out and pulled the chain free gently. The door creaked. He knocked once softly, then again louder. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" Silence. He waited. Then a small whimper, muffled, broken. That was all the confirmation he needed. He pushed the door open. The air inside was thick, damp, stale with the stench of rot and mold. Dust particles floated in the shafts of light like lost memories. The living room was empty except for a cracked mirror on the wall and an overturned chair. Something had happened here, something violent. The wallpaper peeled like old skin. A ceiling fan dangled by its wires, spinning slightly from the draft of the open door. The sound came again, from behind a door down the hallway. He moved toward it, slow and cautious. Each step creaked. The boards below him groaned like they didn't want him to know what was waiting at the end. He stopped at the door. It was closed, but not locked. A faint, shaking sound came from within, small gasps, as if someone was trying to hide their breathing. He placed his hand on the doorknob and turned. The room was almost pitch black, save for a crack of sunlight slipping through a broken slat. It illuminated the corner where she sat, the girl. She was huddled against the wall, knees to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them like a shield. Her face was tear-streaked, dirt smeared across her cheeks, a bruise darkening her temple. Her eyes locked with his the moment he entered, wide and terrified, like a wild animal cornered and ready to run. But there was no strength left in her. She didn't move, she just stared. Imran knelt slowly to her level, keeping his hands visible, his voice soft. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm here to help." She didn't respond. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Her eyes darted to the doorway, as if afraid someone else might come in. Someone she feared. He looked around. No signs of anyone else, no voices, just the girl and her silence. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. "Do you want to come with me?" Still no answer, but her body shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. It was enough for him to know she wanted to believe him, but trust was not something she could offer easily. Not after whatever she had endured. Imran reached into his pocket and pulled out a small toffee he always carried for his own son. He placed it on the floor between them, not as a bribe but as a peace offering. The girl's eyes flicked to it. Then back to him. He stayed quiet. After a long pause, she extended her small hand, trembling, and picked up the toffee. She didn't eat it, just held it close like a token of safety. Imran exhaled slowly, a quiet victory. He held out his hand, palm up. Let's get you out of here. For the first time, she moved, not much, just leaned forward a few inches, but it was the first real movement of trust he'd seen. It was enough. In that moment, nothing else existed. Not the fear, not the judgment of others, not the danger that might come after. Only this one human being answering the cry of another. He had heard what others ignored. And that changed everything. The girl's hand was so light in Imran's that he barely felt her fingers. But the weight of her trust settled heavily on his heart. She moved like a whisper behind him, each step hesitant, her wide eyes scanning every corner of the decaying house as if expecting a shadow to come alive. Her silence screamed louder than any cry could. Imran didn't speak. He knew that right now, words were not what she needed. Safety was. As they stepped out into the dim corridor, he kept his body shielded in front of her, instinctively protective. The air still smelled of mildew and rot, and every floorboard threatened to betray their presence with groans. Imran glanced at the broken frames on the wall, pictures of people long gone, their faces now smudged with time and neglect. The house had once been alive, filled with voices and laughter perhaps. Now, it was only a tomb for echoes and ghosts. Suddenly, from somewhere deeper in the house, a door creaked. Both he and the girl froze. Her grip on his hand tightened, fingernails digging into his palm. She didn't say anything, but her eyes, wild with fear, locked onto his with a silent plea. Don't let them find me. Imran didn't hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms. She weighed next to nothing, her body trembling as she pressed her face into his chest. The noise came again, closer, a dragging sound like furniture being moved or heavy footsteps sliding across the floor. He had no time to think. With a surge of panic, he rushed toward the front of the house. The open door was just ahead, but something slammed hard somewhere behind him. A loud metallic bang echoed through the hall, followed by a low growl of a voice. Words muffled and angry. Someone was in the house. Someone had returned. Imran pushed forward. The girl whimpered quietly, but held on tighter. He reached the front door, heart pounding, and yanked it open fully. The rusted hinges resisted. A shout rang out from behind. A man's voice, furious, laced with threat. Imran didn't turn around. He bolted through the threshold, down the rotting porch steps, nearly tripping over broken tiles and tangled weeds. He didn't stop. The gate screeched as he pushed it open, nearly tearing it from its hinges. His chest burned from the exertion, but he didn't dare slow down. Behind him, footsteps pounded, a door slammed, curses flew through the air. Imran sprinted down the alleyway, holding the girl close. She was clinging to him now, arms around his neck, breath shallow and fast. Her tears soaked through his shirt. He didn't know where to go, only that he had to get as far away from that house as possible. He emerged onto the main street, blinking against the sudden sunlight. People turned to look. Some curious, some alarmed, but no one stepped forward to ask what was happening. The neighborhood watched with its usual passivity, eyes peering from behind curtains and newspaper stands. A man with a child in his arms running through the street wasn't their business. He made it to the next block and ducked into a narrow lane, leading to a park that was mostly empty. Behind a line of bushes under the shade of a neem tree, he finally stopped, panting. He lowered the girl gently onto the grass. She stayed curled, arms wrapped around her knees, head down, rocking ever so slightly. Imran crouched beside her, trying to catch his breath, trying to find the right words. "Who was in that house?" he asked gently. She didn't answer. "Was he the one who hurt you?" Her shoulders twitched, and then she nodded barely, almost invisibly. Imran's fists clenched. A fire built in his chest, not just anger, but helplessness too. The system, the silence, the ease with which someone could hurt a child and go unnoticed, it all made him sick. But right now wasn't the time to rage. It was time to comfort. "Do you have a name?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then whispered something so quietly he almost missed it. Aliza? It was the first word she had said to him. Aliza, he repeated gently. That's a beautiful name. She didn't look up, but he could see her breathing slow a little. He sat beside her on the grass, giving her space but not letting her feel alone. Minutes passed like hours. He didn't press her, didn't touch her, he simply waited. Eventually she spoke again. I didn't think anyone would come. Imran swallowed hard. His voice was rough with emotion when he answered. I didn't think I'd hear it, but I did, and I'm not leaving you. She nodded slowly, and for the first time her eyes met his eyes, full of pain, yes, but also the faintest flicker of something else. Hope. He didn't know what the next hours would bring. He didn't know if the man back at the house would come looking. He didn't know if the police would listen or if social workers would do their jobs. But one thing was clear. The moment he broke that door, he broke more than wood. He shattered the silence that had held Aliza prisoner. And now that he had, there was no turning back. Aliza sat on the edge of the clinic bed, legs dangling above the white tiled floor, her tiny fingers gripping the edges of the sheet beneath her. She hadn't said much since they arrived. The nurse had been kind, her voice soft, her touch gentle, but Aliza remained quiet, eyes darting between the walls, the door, and the window like a bird constantly scanning for an escape. Imran sat nearby, hands folded tightly in his lap, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions inside him. Anger, sorrow, fear, all fighting for space in his chest. The doctor had examined Aliza carefully, documenting bruises and scratches, the signs of malnourishment, and the older wounds. The ones already healing into scars. But it wasn't the physical pain that hit Imran the hardest. It was her silence, her eyes. She looked at the world like it had betrayed her. And maybe it had. The doctor's voice was low as he spoke to Imran outside the room. She's stable, he said, but deeply traumatized. It's going to take more than food and rest. She'll need therapy, safe space, a lot of patience. Imran nodded. She won't be going back there. The doctor's gaze met his, and the unspoken weight passed between them. They both knew that even though the house had been left behind, the memories hadn't. Some doors, once opened, never fully closed again. When Imran returned to Aliza's side, she was still sitting exactly as he'd left her, but her eyes found his. For a second, they studied him, not out of fear, but calculation. Could he be trusted? Would he stay? Would he change like the others did? Imran sat on the chair across from her and smiled gently. They said you're very brave, he said. And I agree. She didn't respond, but her posture loosened just slightly. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out another small toffee. This time she took it immediately, unwrapping it with shaking fingers and popping it into her mouth. A quiet thank you flickered across her face, not in words, but in a softer expression, one that reminded him, she was still a child beneath all the fear. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, he said, but I'll sit with you as long as you need. After a long pause, she whispered, they never let me have sweets. Who's they? Imran asked gently, her lips pressed together. She looked away, her small frame tense again, but she had spoken. That mattered. He nodded, not pressing. Well, you can have all the sweets you want now. Tears welled in her eyes at that, and Imran realized it wasn't just the toffee. It was the kindness. Unconditional, with no demand in return. She wasn't used to that. She didn't know what to do with it. That night, Imran brought her to the shelter center connected to the clinic. It was run by a woman named Farah, someone Imran knew through a mutual friend. Farah had spent years helping children like Aliza, silent victims of invisible wars fought behind closed doors. Farah knelt beside Aliza as she was led into the small, warm room with painted walls and soft bedding. This is your space now, she said with a smile. No one can hurt you here. Aliza clutched the stuffed bear that Farah offered her, staring at it as if it were foreign. Then, to everyone's quiet surprise, she walked over to the bed and sat down. Imran stood at the doorway, his heart full, yet heavy. He wasn't sure what had led him down that alley, why that cry had reached him when no one else had turned their head. Maybe fate, maybe memory, maybe both. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't walking away from her. Before he left, he crouched beside her bed. "I'll come tomorrow," he said, "if you want me to." Aliza didn't say anything. She looked at him, clutching the bear, her face half hidden by its soft fur. Then she did something that broke him in the quietest way. She nodded. That night, Imran walked home under a sky filled with stars he hadn't noticed in years. Every step echoed with the weight of what he had seen, but also with something new. Purpose. He remembered his son's bedtime story waiting at home, the familiar warmth of his wife's voice, the peaceful quiet of a life he had once taken for granted. And he also remembered Aliza's eyes, how much they had endured, and how much they still hoped. The next day, he returned with a bag filled with snacks, drawing paper, and colored pencils. He didn't know if she liked to draw, but it was something to give her control, a way to let her speak without words. When he walked into the room, she was sitting by the window, the stuffed bear in her lap. This time, when she saw him, she didn't just nod. She smiled, just a little. But it was enough. The morning sun had barely risen when Imran found himself standing outside the local police station, holding a file he'd spent most of the night preparing. Inside it were photos from the doctor's report, notes from the shelter coordinator, and a short statement Aliza had whispered to Farah the night before. A few broken sentences describing the man who had locked her in that crumbling house. Imran's hands gripped the file tighter than necessary. He wasn't nervous. He was angry. He walked through the station's gates, past indifferent constables sipping tea and yawning, and straight to the reception desk. The officer on duty didn't look up at first, flipping through paperwork with one hand while his other rested lazily on a chipped desk fan. "I want to file a report," Imran said clearly. The officer finally glanced up, his eyes tired and uninterested. "What's it about?" Imran placed the file on the desk and opened it. "A missing child found locked inside a house, abused, malnourished, threatened. I have her medical report and a statement from a social worker." The officer raised an eyebrow but still didn't move with urgency. "You found her, you're not related." "No," Imran replied, his voice steady. "I just listened when no one else did." A pause. The officer took the file and began leafing through the contents. His expression gradually changed, casual indifference tightening into faint discomfort. He muttered something under his breath and got up to fetch his superior. Within 10 minutes, Imran was sitting across from a sub-inspector in a dimly lit office filled with cigarette smoke and dusty files. The inspector was lean, his face worn with years of seeing more than he probably wanted to. He read through the file slowly, tapping a pen against the desk, saying nothing for several minutes. "She's safe now?" he finally asked. "Yes," Imran replied, "but that man is still out there." The inspector looked at him. "You're a brave man, Mr. Imran. You know," the inspector sighed, "cases like this, they're not easy. No formal complaint from the family, no CCTV footage, no eyewitnesses. It's complicated." Imran leaned forward. "So a child gets locked up, abused, and we call it complicated?" "No, we call it bureaucracy," the inspector replied. "But we'll open a preliminary inquiry." It wasn't the justice Imran had hoped for, but it was a start. That night, he returned to the shelter. Aliza was waiting by the window again, hugging her bear, the drawing paper he'd brought now covered in lines and swirls. When she saw him, her eyes lit up, not brightly, not fully, but enough to show him that she had begun to believe he'd keep showing up. He didn't tell her about the police report. He didn't mention the inspector's warning that the case might stall. He just sat beside her, asking if she wanted to draw together. She handed him a crayon, read. The following days were filled with back-and forth visits to the police station, endless paperwork, and phone calls to legal aid groups. Farah helped connect him with a women's rights lawyer who agreed to take on Aliza's case pro bono. Imran had never imagined himself navigating a legal maze, but something inside him refused to let go. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread. Some neighbors whispered that Imran had brought trouble. Others questioned why he was so involved. A few even muttered darkly that people who poked into others' lives often paid a price. He started receiving strange phone calls at night. Silent ones, heavy breathing followed by a click. Once, someone scratched deep grooves across his motorcycle parked outside the factory. Another time, a rock shattered the window of his front porch, followed by a crumpled note, "Stay out of what isn't yours." Imran didn't flinch. He had seen fear before, and he had already lived through worse as a child. Fear had no power over him now. One evening, as he walked Aliza around the garden outside the shelter, she spoke. He said, "If I ever told anyone, no one would believe me, that they'd say I was lying, that I was garbage." Imran stopped walking. He knelt down and looked at her carefully. "You are not garbage," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You are strong and you are not alone." She looked at him, but why did no one come before? He had no answer. Not one that would make sense to her, so he didn't lie. He just said, "Because the world forgets to care, but I won't." The next day, the police finally visited the abandoned house. The door had been bolted again, and the inside had been scrubbed clean. The man who Aliza later identified as a distant relative she had been left with after her parents' death had vanished. But the report was filed, Aliza's statement was recorded, and Imran's persistence had forced a crack in the system's wall. People began to notice. The local newspaper ran a small article. Social workers from neighboring towns reached out, and other stories began to emerge, quiet ones. Whispers of children hurt in silence, of people who wished they'd spoken up. Imran hadn't just fought for Aliza. He'd awakened something in the silence, a reminder that one act of kindness could ripple into others. And that sometimes justice doesn't begin in court. It begins when someone chooses not to look away. ChatGPT said. Months passed. The neighborhood that once turned its back on Aliza's screams had slowly begun to change. It didn't happen overnight. People didn't suddenly become saints, but something shifted quietly, cautiously, as if a part of the wall they had built between themselves and the suffering around them had cracked, just enough for light to get in. Aliza, now living permanently in the care of Farah and the Child Protection Center, had grown from a shell into something stronger. Her silence had given way to soft conversations. Her fear had begun to loosen its grip. She still had nightmares sometimes. There were days she wouldn't speak at all, but she also had moments where she laughed, truly laughed. She played with the other children, painted trees and houses in bright, clumsy colors, and sometimes when no one was watching, she sang quietly to herself. Imran continued to visit her every few days. He became something of a fixture, known at the shelter by name, referred to by the other kids as Uncle Imran, and by the staff as the man who reminded them why their work mattered. He wasn't her relative. He wasn't assigned to her case. He had no obligation, and that's what made his presence matter even more. He had chosen her not out of duty, but out of humanity. One rainy afternoon, Aliza sat across from him at the art table. She was sketching something with a blue crayon, her eyebrows furrowed in concentration. Imran sipped tea from a paper cup and watched her, smiling softly. "What are you making today?" She didn't look up. "A house. Your house." She nodded, then hesitated. "But not the old one, a new one, with light and no locks." He nodded, his throat tight. "That's a beautiful house." She kept drawing for a while, then paused, looking at him. "Will I ever be adopted?" The question landed like a stone. Imran set his cup down. "Yes," he said. "One day, the right family will come. Someone who will love you the way you deserve." She nodded slowly, as if measuring how much of that she could allow herself to believe. Then she said something he wasn't prepared for. "Could I stay with you?" The words came out so simply, so gently, as if she didn't quite expect an answer, but just needed to ask. Imran blinked, caught off guard. He had never considered it, not fully. He had a son, a wife, a modest income. A life already busy and stretched. But in that moment, staring into the eyes of a child who had learned to trust him more than anyone else, something inside him shifted. He didn't answer right away. He reached out and gently touched her hand. "I'll talk to Farah," he said softly. "We'll see what's possible." That night, he sat with his wife, Seima, and told her everything. She listened, silent, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long while. Then she said something that surprised him. "I've seen the change in you since that day. You're lighter even when you're tired, and I've seen that little girl's face when she sees you. I think maybe she was meant to find you." He looked at her, overwhelmed. "It won't be easy. There's the system, and nothing that matters ever is." They began the paperwork together. It was long, filled with background checks, home visits, questions, and assessments. Imran and Seima didn't know if they'd be approved. But what mattered was that they were trying, and Aliza knew. That knowledge alone gave her strength. As news of the case spread slowly through the community, people began talking. A few quietly apologized to Imran. Others started asking questions how they could help, if the shelter needed donations, if there were other children who needed support. One shopkeeper even hung a small sign in his window. "Kindness is not weakness, it's courage." Aliza's story was shared at local schools. Teachers began addressing topics they had once avoided: how to speak up, how to notice signs of abuse, how to report it safely. And then, months later, standing under the golden glow of a setting sun, Aliza stepped out of the shelter gate with a small backpack on her shoulders. Her hair was tied in 2 neat braids and her bare, well-worn now was tucked under her arm. Imran knelt down, smiling. "Ready to come home?" She nodded. She didn't say much during the drive, just stared out the window, taking in every tree, every car, every cloud. When they arrived, Seima and their son, Hamza, were waiting at the door. Hamza waved excitedly, and Seima held out her arms. Aliza hesitated for just a second, then walked forward. The next morning, Imran woke to the sound of soft laughter. Aliza and Hamza were playing with blocks on the living room floor. It was the sound of healing, the sound of hope, the sound of a heart once broken, learning how to beat again in safety. Kindness had echoed. It had started with one cry, heard by one man. And it had changed everything.